2005, a BA in Human Movement Science at the University of Pretoria 2004. Dr. Helen Bayne is a sports scientist, a lecturer at the University of Pretoria. She has worked in numerous elite sports programs for more than 10 entire years. With a current focus in sprinting and in cricket, she's also coordinator of the athlete management system at the University of Pretoria. Ladies and gentlemen, a very warm welcome, please, to Dr. Helen Bayne.
Thank you very much. I need to take the years out of those. Starting to give my age away a little bit. Afternoon, everybody. Thanks for sticking around for the after lunch session. I'm going to chat today a little bit about measurements in sport and why that is something that matters. The aim today is not to tell you what you should be measuring or even how to do it, but more about an approach for how you should be maybe thinking about it and some of the principles that you might want to consider within your individual sport codes. It's also not about specific devices or measurement tools or gadgets or gimmicks. It's not a sales pitch trying to sell you any devices. Although you will see some examples of what we use, it's really more about thinking how and why you should be measuring things, if at all, in your programs. Sport is, by definition, about measurement. You do it without even realizing. We measure performance of athletes. We want to know who is the fastest, whether it's over 100 meters or 42 kilometers. We want to know who can jump that are part of sport. Before a little sidebar, so it's a picture of a Formula One car here. It's the second one you've seen today, maybe more, I don't even know. There's been a few. Ross Tucker used a picture of a Formula One car earlier this afternoon or this morning. There'll be a few similarities between some of the things that he said earlier and some of the message I'll hopefully give through this talk. Completely unplanned. I had no idea what he was going to be talking about, but I think it's probably a good thing that we're repeating similar messages. Hopefully that'll come through. So Formula One car. The performance measure for this might be that it can go from stationary 0 to 100 kilometers per hour in, let's call it 1.7 seconds. That's what Google told me. I don't really know. I think it's around about that. So that's a measurement. It's a measurement of performance of this car. But do we think that performance is happening because of its engine, because of its aerodynamics, something to do with its tires, maybe the skill of the driver? Or you're probably sitting there thinking, well, it's probably a combination of all of those things, and I'm sure that's right. The point is that the performance measure, 0 to 100 in 1.7 seconds, is what? What is the car able to achieve? What can it do? The other things that I've listed, and there are probably many more of them as well, that's getting under the hood of the car, and that's telling us why or how. How is this car able to achieve that performance measure that we're measuring in time to a certain velocity of the car? Why does that matter? Why should we be thinking about the engine, the aerodynamics, the tires, the skills of the driver? Well, those you can think about as your determinants of performance, right? And those are the things that you as coaches actually work on, right? You don't probably just train speed of a car. Go faster and then rest and then do it again and go faster. You're working on a whole lot of different subcomponents or determinants that help that car or your athletes to go faster at the end of the day. Those are the things you're working on. So if we can understand something about each of those components, each of those determinants, and somehow assess those, it might tell us various things. It might tell us relative areas of strengths compared, for example, to the best in the world. So is the McLaren engine as good as the Ferrari engine? And if you as the McLaren team owner knows that, maybe you can focus on your engine if it's not as good as your competitor. All right? And the same can be said for the others. It allows us to make some sort of targeted intervention. If we know we've got the best engine, the best aerodynamics, the best tires, then we can target our intervention on our driving skills. All right? And then the same could be said for any combination of those things. And ultimately, we can then be specific in our intervention to get the most out of the athlete, out of our car, for an optimal overall performance measure. That's important to know when you're winning. It's important to know when things are going well. Why is the car winning? Why is its performance time of 0 to 100 kilometers good? So that we've got a benchmark that we always want to maintain or work towards, maybe with a different driver in the same car. It's also important to know that when times are not so good, okay, so when things break down, we want to know what the cause was. Was there something in our setup that might have caused that to happen? If we can figure that out and go and fix it, do we need to get back to that same benchmark before we're ready to go race again? Or do we need to do something even better to make sure it doesn't happen a second time? So I think a lot of times in sport we start to only try and measure things and assess things when things go wrong. After an athlete's performances have decreased, after there's been an injury. And if we haven't been kind of proactive at monitoring some of the stuff earlier on, then we're not as well equipped to handle when we faced problems. But I guess the same can be said if we don't know why an athlete is winning, why is the car going fast, eventually when there's any problems, or if you want to match that performance with a different person, we don't know how to replicate it. So that's why one of the reasons why these measurements might matter. And your Formula One car might be somewhat like this, or like this, or like this. The same thing, I hope you can see the principles would apply. No matter who your athlete is, what they're trying to achieve, they could have certain performance measures that you want to monitor that are directly linked to their sport, as well as different determinants of that performance. You've seen this quote already this morning. Again, completely unplanned. Measurement is the first step that leads to control and eventually to improvement. If you can't measure something, you can't understand it. If you can't understand it, you can't control it. And if you can't control it, you can't improve it. We're all about improving things when you're coaching. So what this is telling us is that if you don't have some way of assessing the things that you're trying to improve and control, you can't really understand it, and we're not going to get the improvement we're looking for. But I always, whenever I use this quote, I always follow it up with this one. Just because you can measure something doesn't mean that you should. And that hopefully also echoes some of the messages you heard earlier today. We are completely surrounded by measurement tools that we can use. Some are very simple, some are more complex, but we can measure just about everything you can think of. But it doesn't mean we should, for various reasons. But that, I guess that poses the question, so what should we measure? And I take this approach. First step to deciding what you should measure is to decide what matters, be that for performance or be that for injury, reducing the risk of injury. Okay, decide what matters. And that doesn't mean off the top of your head just guess what matters. It means use the evidence you've got, use your knowledge and experience, use internal investigations that you test to see what has an effect on performance or injury risk. But decide what matters. Know what those variables are, those determinants of performance or those risk factors for injury. If you know that, then you can start exploring ways to measure it. All right? And some of the main things that we need to consider when we're deciding how to measure something is, do we have a valid way of doing so? All right? So that means that the tool we choose to use to measure whatever we decide is important is actually going to be able to measure that thing. All right? Is it reliable? Is your measurement tool reliable? Will you get the same answer every time you repeat the test if nothing else has changed? Okay, and that's essential because if your test is not reliable and you see a change in your measurement, you won't know if that's because something's actually changed in your athlete or if it's just an error in your measurement. So those are really important things when we're deciding how to measure what matters. And one that maybe doesn't always get the emphasis if you're looking strictly from a scientific point of view, but that is equally important and vital for you as coaches is the measurement feasible? Okay, it's got to be something that is accessible, you can administer it, and you can act on it. So the feasibility of these tests is important, and that comes down to, again, some of the cost-benefit analysis that we've spoken about earlier today. And in order to, don't forget the final step. We're not measuring things just for measurement's sake. We want to know how can we use that information. So we need it to be useful, and we need to act on it. That action might just be continuing to monitor something, looking at it, deciding it's okay, carry on going. But you need to be able to intervene and adjust and change things if the measurement sort of tells you needs to go that way. So that's a framework that I like to use. And just to maybe make this a little bit more clear and help you maybe think about ways you could apply this in your individual sports, I'll show you an example of an approach that we are taking and some of the tests and measurements we're using in our system assembly. And these specific tests are designed to be used in, I've just called it speed athletes. They can be sprinters, it could be soccer players, it could be rugby players, anybody who wants to run fast. These are some of the tests we're using. Running fast, we can measure that directly, and that can be seen as our performance measure. Our 0 to 100 kilometers per hour in the Formula One car, we can measure running speed or the time to complete a certain distance. I'm sure a lot of you do that with a stopwatch. I'm sure a lot of you have done it with timing gates, like an example in the picture here. That is the performance measure of running speed. But if we want to get under the hood, if we want to know the why or the how that athlete is managing to achieve that running speed, then these are some of the things that we've prioritized going through this process of deciding what matters, measuring it with something that's valid, reliable, and feasible, and understanding that these are things we can hopefully intervene on and apply. So maybe understand this. So we've selected 4 tests. There could be probably 40 we could have selected, and we've gone through an internal process of looking at what tests meet the criteria that I've described already. So the 4 there: maximum strength and strength at high velocity. You're probably familiar with this type of curve. It shows us the force-velocity relationship of muscle. So we are able to produce the highest force at the lowest velocity. So if an isometric, so it's 0 velocity, where there's no movement, we can produce really high forces, and the faster our movement becomes, the higher the velocity gets, the lower the force we're able to generate. And both of those are really important qualities in athletics, in running, because in this case we're talking specifically about starting from a standing start. We're starting at 0 velocity, we want to produce high forces, but we still want to produce high force at very high speeds as well. So the maximum strength and strength at high velocity looks at the 2 ends of that scale. Eccentric hamstring strength, so that means the force that the hamstring muscles are able to produce as they're lengthening under tension. That's another factor that we measure, and that the reason that's in there is because that matters for injury prevention. We know it's one of the key risk factors for a hamstring strain injury in high-speed running. And then the 4th one is to do with converting that maximum strength and strength at high velocity into a sport-specific application. So how do we apply that force production in sprint acceleration? And we look at both strength and technical aspects of doing that. So I'll go through each one of those with quick examples. So maximum strength. Maybe there's a few of you in the room that do maximum strength testing with in sort of weightlifting variations, like a maximum squat, 1 repetition maximum, maybe 3 or 5 of a squat or a deadlift or a clean. That's probably the standard, or has been for a long time, the standard of how we test maximum strength. There's some problems with that form of testing, though, in that they can be quite time-consuming. So there's a whole procedure for an athlete to, within a session, to do the test, to build up to what that test repetition is going to be. There's a safety issue, which is linked probably to the 3rd point there of experience. The athlete needs to have experience and good technique in lifting heavy weights in order for you to even try and do this test. So in a lot of cases, in a lot of sports, it's probably not done, even where we are interested in maximum strength, because of time, safety, and experience, especially in the youth programs. So fortunately, there's a way around it, and this has become more popular around in sports around the world, is to do this as an isometric test, where the athlete is standing on a force platform. So there's no movement in this example, so the bar is fixed in the rig. It's not going to move upwards, and the athlete is standing on 2 force plates. So those plates are measuring the vertical force that the athlete's applying down into the ground. And so when we start the test, the athlete drives up as hard as possible against the bar, holds it for 3 to 4 seconds, and we measure the force that's produced during that time. And so it's a different mechanism, a different way of measuring maximum strength. And for us, this was a more reliable and more feasible way to measure maximum strength. And it's also a lot quicker to run through. And this is, for example, the type of information we get out. So this is 2 repetitions. You can see they're about 3 seconds long. The 2 traces there is from the left foot, left and right sides. So we can combine those together to get total force, and that's the maximum strength measurement. We'll measure peak force. But what we can also see by having the athlete stand on these 2 individual force plates is that there's maybe an asymmetry between 2 sides. So we're getting really kind of high density information through this measure. And it's an example, I guess, of measuring not just the performance outcome, the peak total force, but also what's under the hood. How are they generating that total force through the left and the right side? So that's the first one. Taking the maximum strength and now trying to produce the maximum force in a higher velocity movement. We use a counter movement jump. A very common test. A lot of you have probably also done it in your programs. Some form of a counter movement jump for maximum height. And you're probably measuring jump height. We do the same, but you can see that we've got the athlete now standing on those 2 force plates once again. Let's see if this plays as a video. There we go. This is playing in slow motion. All right, so a simple counter movement jump, the athlete's instructed to jump as high as they can, and we measure the force on the force plates while they're doing that. We calculate jump height. I'll go through the next one. Yeah, so we calculate jump height, which is your performance measure. What is the athlete able to achieve in this movement? But the added technology allows us to get under the hood again, and we can measure things like peak force, how fast that force is being produced on the slope of those force curves. We can look at different timing measures, like how long are they spending on the descent and the propulsion phase, and those types of things, and many other metrics. We can again look at asymmetry between the left and the right sides. So we're getting additional information that's not only telling us what the athlete's doing, but how they are doing it. And that can give us additional tools of where we can intervene. So we're now not only trying to intervene on jump height, but on how are they actually doing the movement to improve their performance. One of the interesting things we're looking at is this measurement in combination with the previous one, so the isometric force production, as well as the force at high velocity. And with that, if we look at it as kind of a ratio, it gives us an indication of the athlete's relative strength at low and high velocities. You might have an athlete that's very strong, maximal strength in the isometric test, and relatively weaker on this one. And that might tell us that that's the type of targeted training we need to be doing, or vice versa. The third example that I highlighted was this eccentric hamstring strength. As I mentioned in the previous slide, this is a major injury risk factor in high-speed running. So that's why it's in our bucket of important tests. This should also play as a video. So you can see the athlete lowering down in this Nordic hamstring curl. And over his ankles, if you can see there are these sort of hooks, and they're connected to force transducers in that machine. And in real time, as the athlete's doing that movement, they're reading the force output on both ankles. So you can see the coach there with an iPad, and in real time, that information is streaming from the device called the Nordboard into the iPad, and we get summary of results. So this is a plot of a whole group of athletes showing a left and right peak force from that test. So a simple to administer, pretty quick, feasible, shown to be valid and reliable and related to injury risk. And so that's why it's an important part of our testing protocol. Last one, so those strength measures now we take and convert them into a sport-specific application of running as fast as you can from a stationary start. We could measure just their running speed with the timing gates. We supplement that with using a radar gun method, where you can see in the picture we're standing a few meters behind the athlete in the starting blocks with the radar gun, and that measures their velocity as they go from 0 and increase their running speed as they do a maximum effort, probably a 30-meter trial in training. So we can measure velocity in that way, and through some calculations, we can now also calculate from that method how much force they're applying, now not in the vertical direction as they did in the jumps, but in the horizontal direction, which is helping them to accelerate. And some additional metrics out of that help us to monitor. Again, jumping ahead. So it gives us additional measurements that allow us to be more specific and targeted in our intervention by not just training speed, but training the components of speed. Is the athlete able to produce force in the horizontal direction at a low speed when they start and at a high speed when they're running? And we can be more specific, hopefully, with our training through that. The final example is a fairly new method that we've started using with some of our more elite athletes. Majority of our athletes, when we look at running technique, we use video analysis. Ross rightly mentioned earlier today, you've all got a pretty good camera in your pocket right now, and hopefully you're using that in coaching because it's a really good coaching tool. We're starting to supplement that with some objective measurements. So there's some devices that the athlete wears on different body segments when they're running, and it gives us this skeleton image, but more importantly for us, it gives us some measurements of the biomechanics of their running technique. So I'll play that through. This is also going to play in slow motion. So the graphs you can see on the left-hand side is the hip, knee, and ankle angles of the left and right leg as the athlete is doing their sprint start. So those are some of the measurements that we're using for, like I said, our speed athletes. For sure, there are aspects of this that are definitely prone to the data overload that we've heard about. And so this is not by no means something that should be applied in every environment, in every situation, and it would vary greatly by sport. But I hope that gives you an example of the approach, and you could think about what applies in your environment. So in a nutshell, measurements are needed so that you can manage the things that matter for performance. We can measure performance outcomes like speed, height, weight lifted, but if we've got the availability, access to methods to measure those performance determinants, they can certainly add a whole lot of value in helping you target your training. Crucially, all those things that you measure, you should be using tools that are valid, reliable, and feasible for you in your environment. And I think the last point that I just want to make is that I think the value in doing this relies heavily on sharing and collaborating with people around you. We are able to work with a lot of data or access a lot of data these days, and it's probably too much for one person to handle on their own. Especially as a coach, the support team is essential in that. I think people are more open to sharing and collaborating than many of us are aware if you have the conversation. So don't feel that you don't have access to things and they're not available and you can't do it. Talk to the people around you, and I think you'll find a supportive environment that can help steer you in the right direction. And I'd be happy to take any questions, hopefully, if you have some. Thank you. have time. I think we have time. I don't need to add anything, but I'm happy for questions. No? But if not, we can straight away.
We've got like 5 minutes. Is there anybody with a question? With any question that you've been sitting with today? I don't want you to get home with that question and be like, I had a question, but I was too afraid to ask the question. But we've got somebody who's going to ask a question.
Thank you, Dr. Helen. Your info, and when you guys test, is it pre-testing to support the coaches, or is it sort of not post-testing, because you spoke a lot about under the bonnet, figuring that out? Is that pre the competition, or to try to understand why the athlete performs the way they perform?
Yeah, so there's different times where we might apply this. And depending on the time and the goal of that testing battery at that certain time, this might vary slightly. So, for example, that whole battery of tests might, maybe even with the exception of the specific sprint work, might happen at the start of a pre-season, we're going to call it that, as a baseline for where athletes are at. The coaches and the sports scientists might choose to repeat some of those tests more frequently than others. It might be weekly. It might be after a certain training block. It might be before competition, or weekly. And the sprint stuff might come in closer to competition, where it's more specific to that the performance in that skill. So it varies. That's not something that is prescriptive. It's not to say you must do all of these tests at this time or this time. It's really should be seen as part of the conversation with the broader picture. And these are probably not the only measurements and things that you're looking at with this group. So it has to be kind of looked at in context of the bigger picture.
And, sorry, last question. In the case of anomalies, because obviously not all athletes test the same, and some athletes, every now and then you find that odd one, from a testing point of view, they're either terrible, yet their performances say something different. Is it a case of trying to change them, obviously based on their testing, and to try to get them to adapt, or what happens then?
A very good point. I mean, this is a complex animal we're dealing with. This athlete, these 4 things are not the only determinants of performance. Now there would be another set of 4 things that you might select. And yeah, so you will get athletes that are excellent athletes and perform well below on some of these measures. You would, depending on what they are, maybe it's a bit difficult to generalize. If they are strength type of measures, for sure, that's something you could intervene on and would hopefully translate over into their overall performance. When it comes to technique, that in itself is a whole complex thing on its own. That there are some kind of rules that apply that will always make a person more efficient at that skill. But outside of that, there's a whole lot of individual variation that we have to allow because we're working with individuals.
Are there any more questions? No more questions. Right, ladies and gentlemen, once again a round of applause.